Hello my fellow Archons, and welcome at long last to the video project that I've been teasing at for quite some time now. The video where I'll be ranking, from worst to best, every single artifact in the game of KeyForge. However, I knew from the very beginning that this was not a task I could hope to undertake on my own, so I have with me, here to help, the one and only, Mortivas.
Hey! It is I, Mortivas, an old crotchety man from the game of KeyForge. Thanks for having me, Aembermedes.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here, and I'm looking forward to doing some artifact ranking with you. And I think it's going to be a great time. Happy to be here, happy to be helping out with this exciting video for a pretty big milestone on your channel.
Absolutely. It was supposed to be 500 subscribers, and now I'm like almost already at 600, so I guess it's the 600 subscriber special. Without further ado, let's take a look at some numbers real quick before we start truly ranking these artifacts. Up to date, throughout the 5 current sets of KeyForge, there are 189 artifacts. Unsurprisingly, the house with the least amount is Unfathomable, with 7. After that, there are 2 houses, Mars and Starlines, tied at 12 artifacts. Then there's Brobnar at 18, Dis and Untamed tied at 19, and Sanctum and Saurian tied at 21. Shadows has a whopping 30 artifacts, but the house with the most artifacts out of any house is Logos at 35. So, in all, there are 189 artifacts total that will be getting ranked today. So relax, maybe grab some popcorn because we're going to be here for quite a while. Now, we're not going to be giving each and every artifact an individual number. There are so many artifacts out there of similar value, and the power of each artifact obviously depends so much on the current situation of the game you're in. Like, how do you determine which order to rank artifacts such as Spike Trap, Eye of Judgment, Skeleton Key, and Echo Pearl? Is one distinctly better than the others? Their effects are all very different, but none of them are truly powerhouse artifacts, and each of them will shine differently in different scenarios. So, rather than giving each artifact its own individual number, we will instead be dividing them up into tiers, from worst to best, F, E, D, C, B, A, and S tier. Now, within F tier and S tier in particular, we will assign them numbers, since those are distinctly the best and worst of the artifacts.
Of course, not everything in each tier is quite equal in terms of power. So if an artifact in B tier is definitely stronger than something else in B tier, we'll point that out in this way.
The tiers are each split up into high, medium, and low, meaning we'll have artifacts in low A tier that are slightly worse than artifacts in middle A tier, which are slightly worse than artifacts in high A tier, the best of the artifacts in that tier. It'll all explain itself once we start ranking things, but it just helps keep things organized and hopefully will provide some more accurate rankings.
And finally, the ranks we give these artifacts are by no means absolute or authoritative. Again, it all depends on the situation and the deck the artifact finds itself in, but this list is the most accurate ranking we could conjure up according to us. Yes,
we are prepared for the onslaught of comments telling us just how wrong we are. But without further ado, let's get started.
Starting at the very bottom, what could be the worst artifact in the game? Well, we happen to have it from Dark Tidings Saurian, the one and only Trojan Sauropod. It's a truly awful card, recognized as one of the worst in the game, reading, Trojan Sauropod enters play under your opponent's control. Omni, Game 3 Ember. Your opponent reveals their hand and puts each creature from it into play ready, then refills their hand as if it were their draw card step. Destroy Trojan Sauropod. 99 times out of 100, it will not be worth giving your opponent a free half a key just for you to throw a few creatures on the board out of turn. Obviously, there are scenarios where handing over Trojan Sauropod would be helpful. If you just so happen to have a ton of creatures in hand, maybe you picked up your archives so you have lots of creatures, but these scenarios are few and far between. Trojan Sauropod is a discard for me almost every time. In our opinion, it's a failure of card design. The trade-off the card offers leans way too far in the opponent's favor, and that's why we label it as the worst artifact in KeyForge.
At number 188, we have Wretched Doll from House Dis. Wretched Doll is neat because it involves a unique counter, the Doom counter, but it's some of the slowest removal in the game. First you have to call Dis and play Wretched Doll. Then you can call Dis again later and place a Doom counter on a creature. Then you can call Dis a third time to destroy the creature with a Doom counter on it. All of that to destroy one single creature, and the fastest it could happen is by calling Dis 3 times in a row, something that probably wouldn't be very advantageous in the long run. I rarely get any use out of Wretched Doll. At the most, I destroy one creature in a game. So, because of its sluggish speed, extremely limited board control, and the fact that it doesn't even have an Ember bonus icon, it ranks at number 188. At 187 is the unfathomable Effigy of Melaruk, and like Wretched Doll, it involves a unique counter, the Awakening counter. It reads, after an enemy creature reaps, put an Awakening counter on Effigy of Melaruk. If there are 6 or more Awakening counters on Effigy of Melaruk, move it to a flank of your battle line as a creature with 100 power and 100 armor. Its text box is considered blank. Once it hits the board after 6 counters are placed on it, it's by far the largest creature in the game. It would require 10 Deucelesses in order to fight it off the board, making it practically impervious to fights or direct damage. However, it's still fully vulnerable to direct removal, like Draining Touch or Implosion, just like any other creature. Board states in KeyForge are just far too volatile for even a 100 power, 100 armor creature to have that much of an impact. It's good for capturing Ember onto, or for fighting into big creatures with no risk of knockback, but in the end, it's really just very simple and vanilla as a creature, and requires certain actions from the opponent to do anything as an artifact.
At number 186 is the infamous Nepeta Gigantica, a Worlds Collide exclusive. What even is this card? And still, it has no Ember pip? Nepeta Gigantica offers such limited utility, only being usable against giant creatures, which is an exclusively Brobnar trait, and creatures with 5 or more power, and the utility is nothing more than a single stun. Stunning isn't a very often utilized mechanic to begin with, and Untamed definitely isn't a house known for its ability to stun, so Nepeta Gigantica is a very odd and unwelcome addition to the house. At number 185 we have the Mars artifact Sniffer. It makes each creature lose elusive when used, so it's good for setting up a turn where you may want to get some fighting done with your Mars board, but not much else.
Keeping in Mars, we have Custom Virus at number 184. With this one, you purge a creature from your hand, then destroy each creature that shares a trait with the purged creature. I feel like in most scenarios, this would just end up damaging your own battle line more than the opponent's. Unless the two of you happen to share houses and similar types of creatures on the board, if you're purging a creature from your own hand, chances are high that a number of creatures in your deck will share a trait with that purged creature. Either way, it's still a really weird form of removal, and can only be used once as an Omni ability. Number 183 is a rather infamous artifact, Sacrificial Altar. It reads, action, purge a friendly human creature from play. If you do, play a creature from your discard pile. Sacrificial Altar gains some notoriety in Call of the Archons for occasionally appearing in decks with no human creatures, rendering it completely useless aside from its Ember pip. Even in decks with humans, Sacrificial Altar still rarely did much. The most use I ever get out of it is purging something like a Staunch Knight in order to play out Charette or something again from my discard pile. In the end, it's just a far, far worse version of Exhume. At 182 is Hollowed Blaster. Very few cards in the game are as boring as this one. Mutant Cutpurse is pretty boring, Poke is pretty bland, but Hollowed Blaster is on a level all of its own, with the action ability of letting you heal 3 damage from a creature. Healing is one of those mechanics in KeyForge that's just not all that useful, unless you're gaining Ember for it. The board is just too crazy in this game for healing to have much of an impact, so to have an artifact dedicated to that exclusively, that can only be used on a Sanctum turn and only heals 3 damage, is pretty pitiful.
Number 181 is Spangler Box. Wretched Doll and Custom Virus are examples of some really odd removal, and Spangler Box is right up there with them. It reads, action, purge a creature in play. If you do, your opponent gains control of Spangler Box. If Spangler Box leaves play, return to play all cards purged by Spangler Box. Being able to purge whatever creature you want off the board feels pretty good. Well, right up there until your opponent gains control of it and gets to do it back to you. Or if the opponent doesn't have Logos in their deck, that's just the end of it. They don't get to use Spangler Box, and you don't get it back, so you really only get to use it once in that case. The purge isn't even permanent to begin with, so if Spangler Box leaves play, everything just comes right on back. It's a very odd card, isn't all that usable, and if there's artifact control, isn't all that damaging. At number 180 is one that may be controversial to some, Tide Warp. Now don't get me wrong, Tide Warp adds a whole new dynamic to the games it shows up in, but rarely is the dynamic a fun one. Rather, it tends to be more confusing and difficult than anything else. The tide is just constantly moving back and forth, switching from one player to another, continuously triggering the effects of things like Hydro Cataloger and Seneschal Sargassa, and you've really got to figure out who gets the effect of Mechabui and this and that. It's just a really overwhelming card, and it can really come back to bite you much of the time, and for those reasons, it lands in F tier. Number 179 is Autocannon, another weird and wacky artifact. It provides the passive rule of deal 1 damage to each creature after it enters play. It's like Bellowing Petrozate, but in artifact form. Autocannon just doesn't do much and doesn't do anything against creatures with armor. It's most effective against 1-power creatures, making them completely unable to stay on the board. There is a neat combo involving Autocannon, Soul Snatcher, and Bad Penny. With those 2 artifacts out, you can Rule of 6 Bad Penny, gaining an Ember from Soul Snatcher every time you play her out, and she's killed by Autocannon and returned to your hand, ready to be played again. But that's an extremely rare combo, and outside of that, Autocannon doesn't offer a whole lot of utility, and can even be a source of anti-synergy in many decks.
In the number 178 slot is an artifact kinda similar to Autocannon. The floor is lava. It reads, at the start of your turn, deal 1 damage to a friendly creature and 1 damage to an enemy creature. Again, the effect just has such little impact, and can be a source of some anti-synergy since it hits your own guys. It can be good for popping wards or dealing with pesky enemy creatures like Duskwitch, but it's ultimately just another example of why Worlds Collide Brobnar is so infamously horrible. And at number 177 is the last F-tier artifact, Orb of Invidious. Now, Mortivas over here is quite the advocate for Orb of Invidious, which is why it's at the very top of F tier, but it's still just not a good card. The 2-sided nature of it makes it a discard 75% of the time, unless you've got something to remove it yourself, or your deck's game plan doesn't include much reaping whatsoever. It's a form of disruption to be sure, but the last thing I want to see is when that disruption can hurt the person who played it as well. And that's F tier. Notice that every single artifact in F tier has been a rare except for Hallowed Blaster. These artifacts just have such little impact on the game, or the little impact they do have is just harmful more than helpful. Thank goodness all these artifacts are rare, because I pretty much never want to find them in the decks that I open.
And with that, it's time to move on to E tier. They're not the worst artifacts in the game, but they are still pretty bad. This is also where we will no longer be assigning individual rating numbers to each artifact. Instead, each artifact will be placed into a group of high, medium, and low artifacts within its respective tier. Let's jump into it.
In low E tier, we have 5 artifacts, starting with Ragwarg. Ragwarg is in a similar situation as Orb of Invidious, in that it's a harmful 2-sided effect. It has potential to dissuade the opponent from reaping, or at least make them think very careful about the sequencing of their turn. However, the same applies to you as the person who played it. Again, an artifact that you probably won't actually play half the time, but one that can be worked around is a little easier than with Orb of Invidious. Joining Ragwarg in low E tier is Swap Widget. Swap Widget has very limited uses, perhaps in the right deck. In a Coda Mars lineup perfectly suited for it, it can put in some work, but 90% of the time it's not doing much of anything. It also relies on you already having at least one ready Mars creature out there to begin with, so it's a multi-turn investment before Swap Widget will start paying off. It's just odd and situational, which is why we placed it in low E. Up next is Doom Sigil, a pretty alarming mass mutation artifact that gives every creature in play poison, and when there are no creatures in play, Doom Sigil gets destroyed. Poison is a pretty rare mechanic, so when you give it to every creature on the board all at once, things can get pretty hectic. Making it so pretty much every creature can kill any other creature, it just seems like there are very few situations in which Doom Sigil would be truly effective. Niflgrounds is another truly odd card. For some reason, the algorithm only allows 1 copy to appear in a deck, so it's impossible to get multiples. The restriction is super weird because Niflgrounds has such an underwhelming effect, essentially allowing you to choose a creature to fight into like a Niffle Ape would, hence the flavor of the card. There are no creatures with both Taunt and Elusive unless Captain Corsage ends up with both those keywords, so you're just really choosing a creature to lose one or the other. It's a very mediocre artifact. And to round off low E tier is another untamed card, the Mysticeti. It reads, Action. Exhaust 1 or more friendly untamed creatures. If you do, give the Mysticeti 3+1 power counters for each creature exhausted this way, and move it anywhere in your battle line as a creature with 0 power and taunt. It works well within the Dark Tidings Untamed meta, comboing with cards like Waste Not and Aembermedes, especially if you exhaust lots of untamed creatures to really bump up its power. but ultimately on its own, as an artifact that becomes a 6, 9, or 12 power creature with no special ability at the expense of exhausting your own battle line, it's just not good for much. It falls victim to the same trap as something like Effigy of Melaruk. It's a big creature and very little else. It does have Taunt, which can come in handy, or that could be taken away with Niffle Grounds.
Moving away from the low end of E tier, now we've got the middle portion to sort through. To start off with, we've got a couple artifacts that are very similar, Soul Fiddle and Irestaff. Enraging one creature at a time can hardly be considered disruptive. Yes, having your Witch of the Eye enraged is never a good feeling, but it still usually has such little impact on the board and the game. It's when it happens in great swaths, like with Old Egad's Evil Twin or Pestergrove, that Enrage actually starts doing something meaningful. I'll also never understand why Irestaff gets an Ember Pip while Soul Fiddle doesn't. Auto Legionary, yet another artifact that feels the need to become a creature. The other artifact besides Sniffer to have the ally trait, Auto Legionary is literally just a 5 power creature. It's cool that he can be used as if he belonged to the active house, but that's the only perk he's really got going for him. At least the Mysticetti has Taunt, and Effigy of Melaruk has 100 power and armor, but Auto Legionary is just a bland 5 power creature. He's nice if you need to even out a battle line to get a leader in the middle or something, but even that has to take place on a Saurian turn because it's an action ability. Let's move back into Untamed with Bear Flute. I do quite enjoy the flavor of this card for sure, but it's ranked so low because it interacts exclusively with only one other card in the game, Ancient Bear. It either heals Ancient Bear, or returns each copy of him from your discard pile to your hand. There are just so many examples of infinitely better recursion out there that Bear Flute just pales in comparison. It does, however, have the perk of resetting your draw pile by shuffling it in with a discard, and I will admit that's a nice added touch. We've also got Creed of Nature, reading Omni, destroy Creed of Nature. If you do, choose a creature. For the remainder of the turn, that creature gains Skirmish and Assault X. X is its power. If there's a fight that really needs to happen, and you need to load up a creature with some extra firepower to get it done, Creed of Nature is there for you. But that's it. It's one and done, a single solid fight, and Creed of Nature is gone. Yeah, definitely belongs in E tier in my opinion. Next, we've got another Dark Tidings ship card, the Submersible. The Submersible just gives each friendly thief creature elusive while the tide is high. 12 of the 28 thief creatures in Dark Tidings already have elusive to begin with, so the Submersible is really only useful for the other half. Such a mediocre effect. I can only begin to describe to you how glad I am that it's a rare, so I never have to see it. And lastly, in middle E tier, we're heading to Mars for Feeding Pit. It has an action ability reading, discard a creature from your hand. If you do, gain 1 Ember. Being able to cycle your hand a little with that discard is nice, especially getting rewarded for it with an Ember. However, like with many of the artifacts discussed so far, its impact is just so small. And now, onwards to High E tier, the best of this tier.
First up of the 5 high E tier artifacts is the aforementioned Pestergrove. It enrages every single creature when they come into play, and let's just say that can result in some pretty ridiculous board states. If your deck can handle it, it can end up being way more disruptive for your opponent than it is for you, and in that case you may want to throw it down. But if your deck's game plan is very centered around getting creatures out and reaping with them, then Pestergrove will probably be a discard. Next is another Hallowed Sanctum item, the Hallowed Shield. It's one of those AoE commons that you're just kinda sad to see when it gets opened, although in multiples with a sizable Sanctum battle line, you can get a lot of fighting done and face no consequences for it. But that's really the only benefit of Hallowed Shield, is to protect your own creatures from fight damage, or it can act as fodder for something like Anahita the Traitor or Oath of Poverty. We've got yet another Dark Tidings ship up next, and it's another Shadows one. It's the Flying Spectre, one of Aembermedes' least favorite cards in the game. In our opinion, it's completely unnecessary for it to be destroyed outright when you lose the tide. That seems like way too much of a penalty. If it instead got exhausted or something like that, that would be more reasonable, especially considering that action Steal 1 Ember is not really that broken of an ability to begin with. It seems like a very poor design, but on that rare occasion when it does happen to go off, it is still a steal, and that's not nothing. Apparently Shadows wasn't the only house that got a lousy deal when it comes to their ship, because the SLRS Australis of House Logos is up next. It reads, Action. Exhaust up to 3 friendly Logos creatures. For each creature exhausted this way, play the top card of your deck, one at a time. Obviously this play can be kinda risky since at max capacity it's essentially like playing 3 Wild Wormholes all in a row. It does combo nicely with cards like Talmage Steelheart or Honor's Kesis, the potency of each of which depending on how many cards you have played in your turn. However, sometimes you may just want to pass on using the SLRS Australis, and even if you do, your turn probably isn't that much worse off for it. The very last E-tier artifact is Amber Conduction Unit. This is pretty much the better version of Ragwarg or Orb of Invidius. It only applies to the opponent and forces them to focus harder on their turn sequencing, though no matter what, their first reap will result in that creature getting stunned. It doesn't hurt you, it's not two-sided, it's just a nice, simple effect that can irritate the opponent every now and then. A perfect artifact to round off E-tier.
So, Mortivas, we're 2 whole tiers in. The artifacts still aren't very good. They're not doing a whole lot.
That's right, Aembermedes. F and E tiers, they're not great.
So what about D tier then? Are things going to pick up at all anytime soon?
Well, the good thing about D tier is that we're finally out of the stuff that hurts you half the time. These upcoming artifacts still really aren't great, but at least the situations where you wouldn't want to play them are few and far between.
Even the stuff in low D tier?
Well, low D tier is still a little bit sketchy, but once you get out of that, things aren't quite so iffy all the time.
Well, great. I suppose we should get recording for this next segment then, eh?
I suppose we should.
Next up we have D tier, where the artifacts finally begin showing some true quality, and that quality can provide some value in a deck they appear in. We only ranked 5 artifacts in low D tier, and they are Shard of Strength, Annihilation Ritual, Spectral Tunneler, Peace Accord, and Pincerator. Peace Accord is a phenomenal anti-fight artifact, however, giving each player 2 Ember upon play can be a big reason to just discard it. And if no one has anything to lose by fighting, that is, they only have 1 or 0 Ember, Peace Accord's anti-fight purpose is just sort of nullified. Pincerator works best with rad pennies in your deck, enabling you to steal with them, then immediately send them back to your draw pile from the flank. It shines in decks with good destroy triggers and creatures with armor. Rad Penny is a favorite as Pincerator fuel, but if your deck doesn't have either of those things, then Pincerator may be a discard. It can put your opponent in a bind every now and then, forcing them to pay close attention to how they build out their board, but neither its disruption nor its combo potential are strong enough to rank it any higher than low D tier. Annihilation Ritual is a weird one. It's a very strong artifact, but not always in a good way. Every creature that would enter a discard pile from play, so pretty much any creature that's destroyed, gets purged instead. In many of the games this artifact shows up in, players end up with tons of purged cards, way more than would normally be found in a typical game. Much of the time, you wouldn't want your creatures getting purged, so unless you're piloting a deck with very low creature count or a deck where the creatures just don't matter much, you probably don't want to be playing this card. Spectral Tunneler has a very bizarre effect. It reads, action, choose a creature. For the remainder of the turn, that creature is considered a flank creature and gains reap, draw a card. The purposes of this artifact seem very fringe and uncommon. You could target a creature in the middle of someone's battle line, then hit it with a Positron Bolt and choose which direction to deal the rest of the damage. It may be useful in interactions with creatures like Titan Mechanic, but it's just overall very odd. The added reap effect is one of the biggest reasons why this is not ranked lower. The last low D tier artifact is Shard of Strength, the shard we believe is the weakest of the 7 of them. It lets you give a friendly creature an extra power counter for every friendly shard, but in the end, 1, 2, or rarely 3 extra power is not very impactful. Extra power can be great on certain creatures, and always has some potential to trip up your opponent a little in their attempts at removal, but in a game with such a volatile board as KeyForge, it's just not the best.
Moving into middle D tier, we have quite a few cards to look at here. The big one is a neat artifact for its unique counter, the Fuse counter, but can tend to take a while to go off, requiring 10 creatures for everything to be destroyed. It's a card that requires a good amount of strategy to properly utilize, and pretty much places the board on a timer. Since it can go off on either player's turn, the opponent may be able to blow everything up before you are ready. So overall, not the best, but still cool and has its uses. The SGS Illuminator is the Sanctum ship of Dark Tidings, reading action, exhaust up to 4 friendly Sanctum creatures. For each creature exhausted this way, stun and exalt a creature. With this one, you're pretty much setting up targets to hit later on, while simultaneously disabling threats that may exist on the board.
It's a neat effect, but it requires exhausting your battle line to activate it. Not a terrible artifact, but not a very good one either. At least better than the other ship cards we've seen so far. Back to cards that get discarded half the time, we have Sorarium. It can act as good disruption, preventing the opponent from reaping if they have the smallest creatures on board between the two of you, but just as often will keep you from reaping if you've got the smallest creatures. It's another one of those artifacts where the two-sided nature of the effect results in a low rank. In a similar vein, we have Dry the River, so that each creature can't reap if the tide is low for them. It really forces you to deal with the tide and keep it on your side if you want to get any reaping done, and against non-Dark Tidings decks this can be brutal. But if you play this artifact and have a hard time keeping the tide high, then you're just screwing yourself over turn after turn, or constantly building up chains to turn the tide back to you. Forum of Giants lands itself in a similar situation, although where Sorarium could end up disrupting yourself, Forum of Giants could potentially give your opponent free Ember. You don't want either of these artifacts showing up in a deck with lots of small creatures. Isotropic Core is just a pretty boring artifact with very little impact, but still acts as a small barrier for your creatures. Signal Fire is just a distinctly worse version of a number of other cards that have a similar effect. It has that Brobnar flavor, making Brobnar creatures fight, but cards like Sigil of Brotherhood allow you to use your Sanctum creatures however you like, and Follow the Leader lets you fight with creatures from every house on your board. Signal Fire is limited and restricting, though granted it still offers out-of-house fighting, which can be a plus. Our next shard is Shard of Pain, allowing you to deal 1 damage for each friendly shard. 1, 2, or 3 damage is often enough to take out those pesky creatures that are usually hidden behind Elusive or Taunt, such as the classic examples of Dusk Witch or Hunting Witch. However, that's still not much, and isn't all that useful in most other scenarios, besides popping wards or gradually chipping away at larger creatures. Next is another really slow form of creature removal, Kilogog's Trench. Where the big one puts the board on a 10 creature timer using fuse counters, Kilogog's Trench wipes out 1 layer of creatures at a time using depth counters. It really takes its time, going deeper and deeper by 1 power level, and can be played around without too much effort and doesn't end up being all that effective very often, landing it in middle D. From the Creed of Nature in E tier, we now have Creed of Nurture in D tier. It reads Omni, sacrifice Creed of Nurture. If you do, reveal a creature from your hand and choose a creature in play. For the remainder of the turn, the chosen creature gains the text box of the revealed creature. This is actually a really cool and unique effect, but in reality ends up only being truly useful in a few very niche scenarios. The fact that it's an Omni makes it far more usable than if it was an action ability, especially when it has access to those classic Worlds Collide Saurian and Starlines creatures. Next are 2 similar artifacts, Snag's Mirror and the Ulfbert device. They both restrict which houses can be called at the start of players' turns, and, especially in the case of Snag's Mirror, can result in some extremely slow and grindy games. Snag's Mirror may have no effect if the 2 decks don't share any houses, but if they match in all 3, then you're in for a ride. The Ulfbert device functions a little differently, but they both require a decent bit of strategy to properly play around, and in many decks they're just not worth it. Being restricted to only 2 houses turn after turn can be dangerous no matter which way you slice it. Continuing through middle D tier, we have another very unexciting artifact in the form of Flamethrower. In the AoA days especially, Flamethrower was a thoroughly mediocre artifact, and even when Worlds Collide came out, it still wasn't good for much besides popping wards. We've also got Fetch Drones, a card that just rarely fires off. Logos doesn't typically have much in the way of Ember control, and sadly Fetch Drones just doesn't add much value to the little Ember control it does have. It's just too finicky. Next we have another sigil, Evasion Sigil. It's a rare Coda exclusive that reads, before a creature fights, discard the top card of its controller's deck. If the discarded card is of the active house, exhaust that creature with no effect. It just tends to add an unnecessary layer of complexity to the game. You need to go through that whole process every single time a creature fights. All that just to create a 1 in 3 chance that the fight won't be completed. It's just not worth it in our opinion. The Quiet Anvil is a very unique card, making keys cost -2. Under the correct circumstances, this can actually be extremely powerful, making for some very cheap keys, but sadly these correct circumstances are very few and far between. As we've seen, these rare, gimmicky cards just don't tend to perform very well, and the Quiet Anvil is no exception. The last 2 artifacts for middle D tier are a couple of the treasure cards from Dark Tidings, Brachynalia and Dead Man's Chest. Treasure cards are pretty neat, but seeing as either player can find the treasure, they can be a bit risky to play out. Thankfully, the treasures each play at least somewhat into the strength of the houses they show up in. Brachynalia relies on creatures with Ember on them, while Dead Man's Chest relies on how many creatures have been destroyed in a turn. The treasures are nice as a background goal to be reached over the course of a game, almost as a minigame, but they're rarely a primary factor of a deck. Don't get me wrong, a gain of 4 Ember is pretty impressive, but again, if the opponent ends up getting it instead of you, that could be devastating.
And now at last we can move on to the highest ranked artifacts in D tier, starting with 2 artifacts that are the exact same, Pocket Universe and Safe Place. It's useful storing your amber away in a place the opponent can't get to it, where they can't steal or capture it. However, it's also risky because if that artifact gets destroyed or removed from play somehow, all that amber goes back to the common supply and is just lost. They're definitely safe to play against decks with no artifact control, in which case they can be a real pain for the opponent, but if there is artifact control, you may want to think twice. Next we've got Mushroom with a View. Earlier we didn't speak very highly of healing as a mechanic, but Mushroom with a View is an instance where it can actually come in handy. Healing 1 damage turn after turn with that Omni ability can make dealing with your creatures a much more frustrating experience for the opponent, and can also stifle the potency of cards like Cleansing Wave or Misery Exploit. Still only 1 healing though, which is why it doesn't rank higher than D. The first scroll, yet another Dark Tidings Saurian artifact that is hard to implement properly and can come back to bite you on a regular basis. It will prevent the opponent from wanting to forge with a bunch of excess Ember left over, seeing as it'll get captured onto their own side, but the same is also said of you when the first scroll is in play, and if the opponent has a way to capitalize on that fact, they probably will. In a similar vein, we have Widespread Corruption, which reads, after a player gains Ember by reaping, a creature they do not control captures that Ember. Widespread Corruption is one of those cards that just prolongs the game and makes things harder for everyone involved, not necessarily more fun. It adds a whole extra step to actually acquiring the Amber from reaping. It's disruption to be sure, but on a whole game-wide scale. Much of the time, you probably won't want to be playing this card because in the wrong deck or in the wrong matchup, it won't play to your advantage. The Round Table. It's a pretty basic artifact, giving each friendly knight creature +1 power and taunt, so nothing too special. Gizelhart's Standard is also pretty simple, giving each friendly creature with Ember on it +1 armor, with exalting a friendly creature on play. Quantum Finger Trap just allows you to swap the positions of 2 creatures in a battle line, which is actually pretty versatile. If you need to place taunt somewhere, or damage needs to be dealt in a specific place, where the effect of a creature requires it to be in a certain spot, Quantum Finger Trap can do what needs to be done. We've got another odd Mars artifact in the form of Combat Pheromones. Like Signal Fire, it's rather restrictive in what it lets you use, but it's unique in that you can use whatever cards you want as opposed to just creatures. Depending on what 2 Mars cards you end up getting to use out of house, like Crystal Hive, Combat Pheromones could be pretty potent, but that's not the case often enough for us to rank it any higher than D. General Order 24 is our next artifact, and this one is very finicky to get to work right. At its best, it can safely reset the board and put you back in a favorable position, but finding the right timing for that is difficult. Another artifact with some timing involved is Strange Gizmo. Like the big one, it wipes every card on the board, not just creatures, and it fires off whenever you forge a key. If you're ahead on board or have elements out there you don't want to get destroyed upon your forging, Strange Gizmo will probably be a discard. But it's still a great way to take out the opponent's artifact and creature lines in a pinch. Despite its strong effect, it still ends up in D tier due to the fact that you may not always want to actually play it. We've just got 2 more artifacts to rank before finishing off D tier, and they both show up in Sanctum: Red Hand Registry and Shard of Hope. Shard of Hope is full of Sanctum flavor, capturing 1 Ember for each friendly shard. It's a decent source of Ember control with a very simple effect. Red Hand Registry looks really powerful at first glance, like Miasma's effect is constantly active, but it's only like half the time that the opponent will steal off you and then put themselves into check, and even then, they could still forge using a key cheat. It's still a really solid tool to have in your deck though, and can put the opponent on edge. And that wraps up D tier. As we continue up the list, the artifacts will get stronger and stronger, and there will be less and less reasons to discard them. Additionally, their effects will have far more benefits and far less drawbacks. There will be exceptions, of course, but this will be the general trend. So take some time to refill your popcorn and maybe give your fingers a break from the furious typing you've been doing in the comments about how blatantly wrong our ratings have been, because it's time to move on to C tier.
So, here we are in C tier, land of the most average artifacts out there. We've only gone through about 60 artifacts so far, so we're about a third of the way done ranking these things. As usual, let's start with low C tier. Cannon. Possibly the simplest artifact in the game. Great for dealing with tiny creatures behind taunt and elusive, popping wards, or hitting your own creatures for their destroyed effects. Nothing wrong with it. Spike Trap is another easy damage dealer, and with the proper setup can get a lot of work done. You just gotta pay attention to where you're placing your creatures, and being able to use it on any turn means you can combo into it pretty well. Static Collection Array is a fun one, rewarding you for keeping the tide with a cheaper key, but punishing you for losing the tide by making your keys more expensive. Plus 1 extra Ember isn't a huge cost, and you really only need Static Collection Array on your side when it really counts, when you're trying to forge. It's a good, balanced threat for the opponent to keep in mind. Hideaway Hole has an Omni effect that lets you choose when to make all your creatures elusive until the start of your next turn. It's another pretty simple effect, but can prove very frustrating for your opponent if they're ever trying to fight into your board, especially if your important creatures are also protected by taunt. It's just that many more fights for them to burn through. It's basic, not very strong, and lands itself in low C. Next are 2 portals, Chaos Portal and Invasion Portal. The 2 cards couldn't be any more different from each other, but they don't differ too much in terms of their potency. Chaos Portal lets you play the top card of your deck if you guess the right house, so it's kind of like Wild Wormhole that only fires if you guess right. It offers some out-of-house play and efficiency. Invasion Portal is essentially Sound the Horns, but in artifact form and for Mars creatures. Sometimes it can call into your hand just the Mars creature to go off on some crazy combo, but sometimes it won't. And it can be quite painful to lose good cards to your discard pile from the top of your deck, even if you are cycling faster. Next is the one and only Whirlpool, a Dark Tidings artifact that definitely has gained some notoriety as time has passed. Not many cards require you to pay as close attention to where you're placing creatures and capturing Ember as Whirlpool, because at the end of every single player's turn, something changes, and a creature switches sides. It can be a lot of fun to play with, it can also be absolutely cancerous to play with. I'm sure many of you out there absolutely adore this card and will advocate for it until the day you die, but for me and Mortivas, it lands itself in low C tier. In the right decks, it can be quite strong, but in the wrong decks, it just becomes a complicated mess real fast, and may hurt you more than help you. Vineapple Tree is a very odd artifact, implementing the use of the unique growth counter, which make keys cost +1 for each of them. It feels weird to have an Untamed, it feels weird to use, but in the end, it is key control through cost and taxing. It's finicky to use and affects you along with the opponent, but still provides some value nonetheless. The last low C tier artifact is another tree, the World Tree. It reads, Action, return a creature from your discard pile to the top of your deck. It's a very uncomplicated effect, great for recurring creatures like Witch of the Eye or Charette, though it can feel a little awkward at times to put it back on top of your deck rather than in your hand. It's great for preparing your next turn in a nice, simple way.
And next up is middle C tier. Echo Pearl lets you exhaust, stun, and enrage a creature. Ritual of Balance lets you steal an Ember if your opponent has 6 or more. And Eye of Judgment lets you purge a creature from a discard pile. They're all very average, uncomplicated cards, middle-of-the-road artifacts that land safely in C. Other artifacts that fit into this category are Mobius Scroll, allowing you to archive up to 2 cards along with Mobius Scroll. Hydro Cataloger, letting players archive the top card of their deck when they raise the tide, and Library of Babel, letting you draw a card. Vision Bloom is always sad to open when there are no good options to use it with, and that tends to happen far more often than we'd like. Every now and then you'll get lucky and open a Logos card with a bunch of enhancements to resolve twice with Vision Bloom, but it's just a disappointment more often than not. Shattered Throne is sad to open in a deck with very few creatures, or lots of small creatures that can't really survive fights. It also hurts that the opponent can use Shattered Throne against you. It's a decent card with a good source of Ember control, but unfortunately can't make it any higher than C tier for us. The first 2 treasures, Dead Man's Chest and Brachynalia, were in D tier, and the last 2 treasures, Ruins of Arcanus and Primal Relic, are here in C. Ruins of Arcanus is phenomenal combo material for Dark Tidings Logos, with cards like Phase Shift, Science, Library Card, and Honor's Kiesis showing up in the pool. If you have a halfway decent Logos house to complement your Ruins of Arcanus, you should be able to claim that treasure before the opponent does. Primal Relic also has some nice matching tools in Untamed with cards like Reaper Sow, The Fittest, Growth Surge, and Genetic Drift boosting up your creature's power. I don't feel like Primal Relic is quite as consistent as Runes of Arcanus, and certainly is a little riskier to play, but their treasure just feels a little more attainable for the person who plays it than the other 2 in D tier. We've also got 2 more ships, the Susurrus and the ISS Indominus. The Susurrus is nice because it allows you to exhaust 3 things for the price of 1, fitting perfectly with Unfathomable and throwing in some disruption. The Indominus, at maximum value, lets you deal 5 damage to each enemy creature, and in most situations, that's almost enough for a one-sided board wipe, unless the opponent's board consists mainly of beefy Saurian or Sanctum creatures. But at what point would it just be more beneficial to use your Saurian creatures rather than exhaust them for the damage? The Colosseum is a whole entire key cheat involving a unique counter, the Glory counter, and it reads, after an enemy creature is destroyed while fighting, put a Glory counter on the Colosseum. Omni. If there are 6 or more Glory counters on the Colosseum, remove 6 and forge a key at current cost. It's a rather convoluted key cheat requiring the Glory counters and a healthy balance between fighting and amber generation, though the fact that it's an Omni makes it a little more usable. And as we'll see in a while, the Colosseum is definitely not the best artifact key cheat out there. Gambling Den is a fan-favorite artifact, a provider of some really fun games and clutch keys. It can't quite compete with many of the stronger artifacts in this list, but the fact that it lets you gain the 2 Ember before the Forge a Key step makes it an enjoyable card to have in almost any deck. Guard Disguise is an interesting one, an AoE exclusive allowing for 1 potentially big steal. At max value, you're stealing half a key, just as much as Swindle. You can set up for it by utilizing other Shadows cards before Guard Disguise, but in most scenarios, you'll probably just end up with a steal of 1 or 2, or you'll be waiting around for ages until a time comes when you can actually even use it. Another Shadows artifact in C tier is Speed Sigil, a card that has become riskier and riskier to play as the sets have gone on. It can really come back to bite you, just like many of the artifacts in lower tiers, but the effect is strong enough and carries enough potential that it landed a little higher than the rest. Back in the Coda era, it probably wasn't quite so risky to allow the first creature of each of your opponent's turn to enter play ready, but once sets like Worlds Collide and Mass Mutation came out, it was discarded more and more often. There are 2 artifacts left in middle C tier. The first is Banner of Battle, giving each friendly creature +1 power. It makes your board just slightly harder to deal with no strings attached, makes some threats like Hunting Witch that much more of a threat, and can trip up the opponent a little. The last one is Soul Snatcher, another 50-50 card. Soul Snatcher can be prime combo fuel, or can result in disastrous amounts of Ember for the opponent. The strategy involved with this artifact is deep, and only ends up in play about half the time or less, which is what earns it a spot in C tier.
Moving into the upper portion of C tier, the best of the mediocre, we have Seeker Needle, an absolute classic, best known for when it's paired with Bad Penny, or Rad Penny in Mass Mutation. Great for finishing off creatures or popping wards, or even setting up for cards like Finishing Blow and Relentless Whispers, Seeker Needle is just an all-around artifact that's far more versatile than it initially seems. Skeleton Key lets a friendly creature capture an Ember. Emberheart exalts, wards, and fully heals a friendly creature. Mother Gun lets you deal a damage to a creature for each Mars card you reveal from your hand. These are all solid, basic effects with no drawbacks or hoops to jump through. One is Ember Control, one is Creature Protection, and one is Board Control, and all of them do what they do just fine. Special Delivery is nice for purging those small, problematic creatures. Just sometimes the trouble with it is finding a target that'll actually get purged from its damage. Shard of Hate lets you stun a creature for each friendly shard, and honestly, this can be a lot more debilitating than it sounds. Getting to stun potentially 3 whole creatures every time you call Mars can shut down a battle line pretty quickly, especially if you're strategic about which creatures you choose to stun. There's also Seismo Entangler, allowing you to keep an opponent's house from reaping during their next turn. Used correctly, this can be absolutely crippling, and its potency varies wildly depending on the situation and which house the opponent calls next. Mecha Buoy is right up there with the likes of Whirlpool and Hydro Cataloger for those artifacts that you either totally adore or utterly despise, with no in-between. But this is another one of those artifacts that just adds yet another passive ability that you need to keep track of, that's always changing from person to person based on where the tide's at, and can easily be forgotten about because of how much is going on in a typical Dark Tidings game. Speaking of Dark Tidings artifacts, we also have Sobog's Thingamabob in high C tier. After your opponent forges a key, each creature they control gets exhausted, and with the right combination of other unfathomable cards in your deck, like Storm Surge, this can be debilitating. And there's also Exploratory Craft, one of the better of the ship cards. It can help you draw into pieces of your combo, or simply discover more of your upcoming deck. Extra efficiency is pretty much never a bad thing, and though Exploratory Craft isn't always the most consistent way of getting it, it still has its uses. Iron Obelisk is a Brobnar classic, reading, your opponent's keys cost +1 for each friendly damaged Brobnar creature. It's not the most consistent form of key cost control, especially if you end up with lots of small Brobnar creatures in your deck, but with lots of beefy, sticky ones like Lollop the Titanic or Narp, Iron Obelisk can be a real pain for your opponent, taxing their keys at +2, 3, or more. The next high C-tier artifact is Book of Malfaction, a rather fun artifact reading, after your Ember is stolen, put a warrant counter on Book of Malfaction for each Ember stolen. Omni, remove a warrant counter from Book of Malfaction. If you do, purge a creature. It discourages your opponent from stealing, threatening them with a purged creature every turn if they steal more than one. It's not the strongest steal hate out there, and sadly you only get to remove one warrant counter at a time, even though multiple can be placed on all at once. But it's not a bad card, one you're never unhappy to see when you open a deck. Next are a couple of the Saurian monuments found in Mass Mutation, Monument to Primus and Monument to Ludo. The monuments are cool because they act similarly to the creatures they're based off of. In the case of Primus, it's moving Ember around from creature to creature on the board, and in Ludo's case, it's moving Ember to the common supply. They're both good effects, but still are very middling in their power, which can be enhanced if the creature they're based off of is in the discard pile. Universal Keylock is a pretty interesting artifact, making keys cost +3 for both players that gets destroyed when someone forges a key. It's a card that takes a little practice to learn the timing of, but it's good as an emergency key stop or some abrupt taxing. Sometimes though, it can result in a game of chicken, seeing who's willing to forge a key at 9 first. The very last artifact for C tier is Crazy Killing Machine. It reads, action, discard the top card of each player's deck. For each of those cards, destroy a creature or artifact of that card's house if able. If 2 cards are not destroyed as a result of this, destroy Crazy Killing Machine. It serves as some pretty crazy, sporadic removal, but still manages to be pretty limited in what it can do, even getting destroyed itself if it doesn't destroy enough stuff. At least it can destroy artifacts in addition to creatures, but it's not the most effective removal out there. Well, at least it's more effective than Wretched Doll. That's not hard to do. There are only 3 tiers that remain: B tier, A tier, and the glorious S tier, reserved for only the best of artifacts.
But before we can get there, we have to go through the 39 artifacts of B tier. So without further ado, let's get into it. Messing with an opponent's hand is always pretty fun, and Subtle Maul, the first artifact of low B tier, lets you do just that. It's even more fun when you get to do it in multiples. Matter Maker lets you play upgrades as if they belong to the active house, so in a deck with lots of upgrades between all 3 houses, that's really nice. Though in decks with hardly any upgrades, it really doesn't do much. And unlike Subtle Maul, Matter Maker is not so fun to get in multiples. Whispering Reliquary lets you put artifacts back into their owner's hand, hopefully preventing the opponent from getting any real use out of them. Or, you can put your own artifact back in your hand and play them again for their Amber bonus. We've also got another monument, Monument to Faust, for some more of that key cost increase. It's some pretty mediocre key cost increase though, since it only increases it by 1 or 2 at a time, but it's increased nonetheless and can put in work. And Miasma Bomb is the new version of Miasma, so instead of chaining yourself with Miasma, waiting for the right time to play it, you can get it out of your hand and store it away as an artifact. It still needs to be used on a Shadow's turn, and it doesn't prevent key cheats, but it's still a super useful tool to have, being able to stop a key whenever needed. There is some risk involved though, since the opponent could potentially use it against you. Next up is another fan favorite, Fangtooth Cavern. Fangtooth Cavern can be a source of anti-synergy in a number of decks, but the combo potential it possesses is too notable to pass over. It works great with tiny creatures that have good destroyed effects, Keyfrog being one of the best. You've just got to learn how to play with this card, and once you do, it's quite the rewarding experience, landing itself in B. Rooftop Laboratory is a Dark Tidings chase card that always appears with 3 other cards: Dr. Varoctor, Reckless Experimentation, and Groundbreaking Discovery. These 4 cards are immensely synergistic together, but also usually within the Logos house itself. Rooftop Laboratory allows each friendly scientist creature to enter play ready. Dr. Varoctor is a scientist along with many of the other creatures in Logos. On its own, Rooftop Laboratory is pretty simple, but can really change the tempo of the game when utilized to its fullest extent, and it's a plus that it only applies to you. An artifact that doesn't just apply to you, however, is Uncharted Lands. It's actually pretty neat, reading Play. Place 6 Ember from the common supply on Uncharted Lands. Each Starlands creature gains Reap. Move 1 Ember from Uncharted Lands to your pool. It's almost like a limited time Crystal Hive just for Starlands creatures. But what's unfortunate is that it also applies to enemy Starlands creatures. So, if your opponent has Starlands in their deck, you may want to think twice about playing Uncharted Lands. But if you're the only one with Starlands, Uncharted Lands is an easy play, especially with the quality of Starlands creatures in Worlds Collide. The War Chest is a classic Brobnar artifact, a key piece of that fun Brobnar burst. With other important cards like War Song and Loot the Bodies, the War Chest can put in a ton of work, but sometimes it just doesn't. If your deck isn't very fighting oriented, you'll probably only end up getting 2 or 3 Ember at a time with it. Its lack of consistency landed it in low B tier. And lastly, we have Animator, a really funky Logos artifact that makes artifacts into creatures. This one just happens to be a little more effective than ones like Auto Legionary or Effigy of Melaruk. Animator is a really roundabout way of dealing with enemy artifacts by making them into creatures and fighting into them, but it's artifact control nonetheless. Animator has tons of cool uses outside of that too, such as making a friendly artifact into a creature, capturing onto it, then when you end your turn it becomes an artifact again, making that captured Ember practically unattainable. So we felt that Animator was good to round off low B tier.
In middle B tier, we've got some pretty good basic effects. Mighty Javelin lets you deal 4 damage to a creature on any turn. 4 damage is nothing to scoff at, and is just a nice simple source of direct damage. Gorm of Am is the classic example of artifact removal, and it's really only risky when the opponent gets to use it against you. Frigorific Rod lets you exhaust a creature or artifact, and that effect is even better in multiples. It has perfect synergy and flavor with the Inflammable House, while remaining effective and easy to use. Imperial Road lets you play a Saurian creature out of house, but it enters play stunned, a balanced price for doing so. Shard of Knowledge allows you to draw a card for each friendly shard. At minimum value, it's Library of Babel, but at max value, drawing 3 cards is pretty awesome. It moves you faster through your deck, ideally would extend your turn, and just offers some good efficiency. Anomaly Exploiter is a quality artifact as well. Any damaged creature is subject to Anomaly Exploiter's ability. If there's a massive creature out there that you just don't quite have the firepower to take off the board, all you have to do is just get a little damage on it, and Anomaly Exploiter will blow it up for you. Potion of Invulnerability is good for setting up a big fighting turn, where some board control needs to happen, and you don't want your guys to take damage. In a similar vein, we have Lucky Dice, where your creatures can't take damage on your opponent's next turn. It operates as some great creature protection, making it so your opponent has limited ways to deal with your board. Fighting is pretty much out of the question. Another Shadows artifact is Trickle Down Theory. It raises the tide for you with its play effect, then allows you to gain an Ember on any turn where your opponent has 6 or more, so it's decent overall, especially with 2 or 3 of them. Forge Compiler is a card that can make your opponent really sad to forge. If you have a great big battle line that gets warded when your opponent forges, that can be a real game changer. That's a huge amount of creature protection, and if your opponent doesn't have a way to deal with it, they could be behind on board for quite some time. We also put Screech Bomb in middle B tier, an Omni effect to make your opponent lose 2 Ember. No drawback, no strings attached, just 1/3 of a key, gone on any turn. Always feels good to open 1 or more of these in a deck. Also in B tier, we've got the Archon's Revenge, the last of the ships and the one we've ranked as best of them all. Compared to the Flying Spectre, Archon's Revenge doesn't get destroyed when you lose the tide, nor do you even need the tide to be high in order to use it. The only stipulation is that you need ready Shadows creatures on your side of the board. Archon's Revenge could potentially steal twice as much as the Flying Spectre, and the only drawback when using it is that you may not end up getting to use your creatures like Hobnobber or Shoulder Id. So, not much of a drawback at all. Altruist Rostrum is similar to Monument to Primus, but without the restrictions that Monument to Primus has, so we ranked it a little higher. Universal Recycle Bin allows you to archive previously purged cards, the only card that lets you interact with purged cards like that. In Worlds Collide, particularly in the purge-centered meta of Dis in that set, Universal Recycle Bin was a unique utility found nowhere else, and could prove quite useful against decks full of Infernuses and Bornits. We ranked Monument to Strix higher than Safe Place and Pocket Universe, because when Citizen Strix is in your discard pile, you can take an Ember from the opponent's pool and place it on Monument to Strix, where it can then be spent for keys. The same risks involved with Safe Place and Pocket Universe still exist for Monument to Strix, but it has that added layer to it that gives it a higher rank. Another great utility card comes in the form of Screaming Cave. Being able to reset your whole entire deck and hand and shuffle your key cards back into your draw pile is of huge advantage. It's definitely not something you'd want to do turn over turn, but if things are growing stale in your deck, Screaming Cave is just the thing to mix things back up and reshuffle early. Mutagenic Serum's potency varies wildly on how many mutant creatures you actually have in your deck. If you only have a couple, you won't be getting much out of this card, but in a true mutant deck, Mutagenic Serum can be pretty insane. It all depends on the rest of your deck, and how well your opponent keeps your mutants in check. Now, I've got to let Mortivas talk about this next middle B tier artifact because it's one of his favorite cards in the whole game, Incubation Chamber.
Yep, guilty as charged, Aembermedes. Incubation Chamber is absolutely my favorite card in the game. I think it's a totally rockin' artifact. First of all, it's from Mars, which is great. It has awesome art by Balance Sheet and has a really cool ability, which first of all is Omni and doesn't destroy itself. The artifact doesn't destroy itself as you use it. So obviously pretty cool, pretty unique from that perspective. Not a whole lot of artifacts or cards generally that have that style of Omni ability. And it adds efficiency to your deck by allowing you to stuff away Mars creatures. If they're good Mars creatures, then you pull them out later. Have this whole like orbital bombardment situation where they come in hot and just like spam the board and it's awesome. Or if they're bad Martian creatures, then you just kind of forget about them and leave them there. So all in all, I love this card. I realize why we kind of had to put it here. Aembermedes had to kind of talk me down off of just making this the best, jumping right to S tier and putting this at the top of the list. But I think it's a great artifact with a lot of useful benefits and not really any drawbacks.
Yeah, that's why I let him handle it. The last middle B tier artifact is the only artifact that's still in anomaly form, Memolith. This one was so difficult to rank because its uses are so incredibly varied and unusual. We put it in middle B because in most decks there probably won't be a super obvious or phenomenal choice for what card should be grafted to Memolith, but in some cases Memolith is totally busted. So little is known about the mechanic of grafting that it's hard to tell what its true power level is or what it will be, so we put it safely in middle B.
We're starting off high B tier with a shard, the Shard of Life. It offers some fantastic recursion, and with the right cards in your deck, it can be really annoying for your opponent. In AoA, recurring cards like Too Much to Protect, Exhume, and Duskwitch will drive them absolutely nuts. Definitely one of the top shards. We've also got another Monument to Octavia. It offers some great Ember control in the form of capturing, relating perfectly to its matching creature, Cornicent Octavia. A practically identical artifact comes in the form of City Gates. Both allow you to capture one Ember, or allow you to capture two when certain conditions are met. We put them both in high B tier. An artifact that goes perfectly with the previous two is Library of Poliosaurus. A large part of what makes Library of Poliosaurus so successful is the fact that it comes in House Saurian, where there will almost always be Amber on friendly creatures for you to collect, due to things like capturing and exalting. Being able to get that Ember off your friendly creatures and safely into your pool is always a good feeling. A much more complicated artifact comes in the form of Curiosaurus. It's one of the most confusing artifacts in the game, especially when there's a lot going on with the board, and has been a source of confusion through the KeyForge scene. If your board is loaded up with lots of unprotected Ember, it's actually a really handy artifact to have, and can be exploited in some pretty nasty ways, and that lands it in high B. Customs Office is just such a nice, simple artifact, taxing your opponent one Ember every time they want to play an artifact. If they want to put one down, they'd better make sure it's absolutely worth the payment, so it's great as a deterrent. Keyforgery is another interesting Shadows artifact, and it's nice because you don't have to be in Shadows for its effect to go off. With cards like Miasma and Miasma Bomb, you have to call Shadows to use them and prevent the Forge a Key step, but with Keyforgery, it'll happen no matter what. It's a chance-based artifact, but the odds land in the favor of the person who played it. We've got Ritual of the Hunt, along with Sigil of Brotherhood, which we've mentioned a couple times already. Like Signal Fire, they both allow out-of-house creature use, these two allowing the use of friendly Untamed and Sanctum creatures respectively. Untamed creatures, especially in Mass Mutation, will generally be able to put in at least a little more work than Brobnar creatures in terms of generating Ember, and unlike Signal Fire, they allow you to use your creatures however you'd like, so we put them in high B. Two artifacts to go in high B, and the first is the Pale Star, a really unique form of board control that reads Omni, destroy the Pale Star. For the remainder of the turn, each creature is considered to have 1 power and 0 armor. Paired with cards like Dark Minion or in decks with plenty of damage pips, the Pale Star is actually pretty amazing, and the Omni ability makes it that much easier to use. It's a strong card to have, well deserving of its ranking. The last B tier artifact is Compod, a little seen card that can act as a critical component of that classic Mars burst in the decks it appears in. With a sizable Mars board established and a good number of Mars cards in hand, Compod can put in lots of work. And one of its neat factors is that it doesn't get destroyed upon use, but you can use it every time you call Mars if you want.
And here we are, guys, in A tier. This is the last tier to get through before the cream of the crop in S tier. These upcoming artifacts are very strong to be sure, well known for their versatility and offering levels of utility not yet seen in this tier list. Let's jump into it. First up is Long Fused Minds, an Omni ability with the capability of dealing massive damage across the opponent's board, killing the small creatures and putting damage on the bigger ones, setting up for cards like Cleansing Wave or Save the Pack. It's a great example of board control that sets up for bigger combos down the road, and is the perfect artifact to kick off A tier. The final shard is the Shard of Greed. It lets you gain an Ember for each friendly shard, and once you have all 3 shards out, you're gaining a whole extra half a key in addition to whatever other Ember you've generated that Shadow's turn. Even if your deck doesn't have 3 shards, that free Ember gain is nothing to scoff at, and that's the reason why we've ranked it as the best of the shards. Hadrith's Wall is a favorite, offering a free power boost to your 2 friendly flank creatures, whatever they may be. It's just a simple card that offers a simple benefit, and in Call of the Archons, there were certain creatures that were even more terrifying when boosted up with extra power. Another Sanctum favorite is Font of the Eye, providing a wonderful source of Ember control. This card is killer in multiples, and the fact that it's an Omni makes it incredibly versatile, especially within the mass mutation meta. When you need to take an opponent off check, Font of the Eye is a card that can easily get you one step closer to doing so. We've got another ritual in the form of Ritual of Life. It's another versatile card, allowing for some phenomenal recursion of cards like Chelonia or Deepwater Gruin, or even targets from other houses if you wanted to set up for a later turn. It's also well known as a key frog popper, giving your opponent no chance to deal with the cheated key. Speaking of key cheats, Epic Quest is a really cool one, and is one of the few key cheats that lets you forge a key at no cost. The stipulations for pulling off Epic Quest are high, but it's immensely rewarding when you get to pull it off, dropping 7 Sanctum cards all at once in addition to forging a key for free. It's just unfortunate when you pull an Epic Quest in a deck with very few knights. Ceaseforge is another artifact involving a unique counter, the Time Counter. It reads, play, put 2 time counters on Ceaseforge. Players cannot forge keys. At the start of your turn, remove a time counter from Ceaseforge, then destroy it if there are no time counters on it. So it can delay the forging of keys, and can actually win you the game in the right scenarios. It can be a little finicky to work with, but once you work out how to use it to its fullest extent, it can be impressively strong. The last artifact in low A tier is the Howling Pit. The extra efficiency is great to have, at the drawback of offering your opponent that same level of efficiency. Having essentially the effects of a permanent daughter helps you through your deck faster, and will give you access to your key combo pieces quicker. You may want to analyze your opponent's deck list thoroughly before playing it though, just to make sure you don't regret giving your opponent Howling Pit's effect.
Moving into middle A tier, we've got Hologramophone, allowing you to ward a friendly creature, Memory Chip, letting you archive a card whenever you call Logos, and Gauntlet of Command, allowing you to ready and fight with a friendly creature. Hologramophone is a great source of board protection, allowing you a free ward of any friendly creature you want, while Memory Chip allows you to build up that archive for a banger non-Logos turn down the road. 2 Memory Chips is just wild. And Gauntlet of Command is a key piece of Brobnar's artillery, allowing for extra fighting, even fighting out of house, and if there are no enemy creatures to fight, you can reap instead. In a similar vein as Gauntlet of Command, there's Dominator Bauble. Dominator Bauble doesn't ready the target creature, but does allow you to use it however you want, whereas Gauntlet of Command readies the target creature but restricts it to a fight. Key to Dis is one of the most destructive artifacts yet. Cards like the Big One and Strange Gizmo didn't offer you much control in terms of when they would go off, but Key to Dis is a full board wipe that you can trigger exactly when you want without gaining chains. Holding that sort of looming threat over the opponent can put them on edge and keeps you in control of the board, which is why it's ranked all the way in A. Crystal Hive is a Mars artifact of legendary status, reading Action. For the remainder of the turn, gain 1 Ember each time a creature reaps. In the incredibly combo-oriented Coda Mars house, Crystal Hive was a key part of the outstanding burst that house offered, giving 1/3 of a key every reap. It's the unlimited one-sided version of Uncharted Lands, and it's a solid A-tier artifact. The Sting is another famous artifact. Though its potency can really go one way or the other, depending on what else is in your deck, the effect is so impressively strong that it worked its way to A-tier for us. The lines of strategy with the Sting are deep, but making the opponent practically pay you when they forge is devastating. Pretty much just giving you a key at the cost of working out the timing of getting rid of the Sting, since it keeps you from actually getting to forge at all. Lash of Broken Dreams, the last artifact of middle A tier, is a classic. It's restricted to only 1 per deck and increases key cost by 3 when it's used. It's one of the first examples of powerful key stopping and taxing, but has also been known to trap you in House Dis if you don't have any other ways of preventing the opponent's next key. It's simple, has no drawbacks, and is a staple of Coda Dis, firmly taking hold of its spot in the A tier.
We've made it to the top of A tier. Library of the Damned is an archiving menace, allowing you a straight up archive whenever you call Dis. Like with Memory Chip, you can store up tons of cards in a certain house for later, and this build-up is even faster with more than 1 library. Library of the Damned is just slightly more versatile than Memory Chip, since you can call upon it at any point in your turn instead of just at the very beginning, which is why it's high A tier instead of middle. Speaking of archiving, AutoVac 5150 reads, Action, you may discard a card from your archives. If you do, keys cost +3 during your opponent's next turn. Otherwise, archive a card. It's essentially Lash of Broken Dreams, but with a built-in archiving mechanism. You can load up the AutoVac with archives that you can call upon to increase key cost, essentially giving each archived card a whole new value. It's no longer just an archived card, it's something that can tax your opponent's keys, possibly even stopping them altogether. The final 2 artifacts before moving on to S tier both belong to House Brobnar, and they are Pile of Skulls and Grunt Buggy. Pile of Skulls reads, each time an enemy creature is destroyed during your turn, a friendly creature captures 1 Ember. This is just a passive, continuous, consistent Ember control ability that doesn't require activation like Font of the Eye, and even can trigger multiple times in a turn unlike Font of the Eye. And the destruction of the enemy creature doesn't even have to be through a fight, it could be direct removal or damage or anything. Either way, it results in a captured Ember. Grunt Buggy is a classic that makes keys cost +1 for your opponent for each friendly creature that's power 5 or higher, and the same rule applies to you. With lots of big creatures in your deck, you're essentially just constantly increasing your opponent's keys by 3 or 4 or 5, or potentially even more, using creatures that aren't all that easy to take off the board. It can be dangerous to play against decks that also have lots of large creatures, and it's not very good in decks where there aren't really any big creatures, but that effect is still just phenomenal to have nonetheless. These artifacts need no introduction. They're the best of the best, absolute powerhouse cards, some so strong that entire deck archetypes are built around them. However, we do have one caveat regarding a couple of these artifacts, Quixelstone and Heart of the Forest. We have them both ranked in S tier, but we fully understand that these 2 artifacts can also wildly underperform in many decks, and will be discarded every time, almost like an E or F tier artifact. Quixelstone is an extraordinary artifact that completely changes the way the game is played the instant it arrives on the board, but in many decks and scenarios it's not something you'd want to play, despite its power. Heart of the Forest can guarantee wins if you have the right cards to go along with it. Otherwise, it just results in horribly long, grindy games that no one wants to be a part of. And it's become infamous within the KeyForge player base for that very reason, for the sort of gameplay it creates. We recognize that these 2 artifacts can be among the best out there, but can also be among the worst out there. We've put them in S tier for their effect, and for what they can do when utilized to their fullest capability, but they could just as easily land within any tier in this list. With that out of the way, let's move on to the top artifacts in the game of KeyForge, those in S tier.
At number 17 is Safe House, a staple of Mass Mutation Shadows. Safe House is great for archiving any friendly creature with a good play ability, most notoriously used for creatures like Bone-Ithing, particularly late in the game when they can steal the most. There are tons of great targets for Safe House to archive, and its immense versatility earns it a top spot in our list. Number 16 is Master Plan, one of the most flexible artifacts in the game. You truly can craft a masterful plan with this card, storing anything you want underneath it, to spring upon your opponent at the perfect time. This can lead to some pretty astounding combos, accomplishing plays you couldn't find anywhere else. Just make sure your opponent doesn't get the chance to use it against you.
Offering some oppressive levels of disruption, Life Ward holds our number 15 spot. The inability to play creatures is devastating, stifling your deck's efficiency and potentially preventing you from using effects you need on that turn. Proper timing of Life Ward can give you a huge lead over your opponent, and is some of the best House Dis has to offer. At number 14 is the House-breaking Book of LEQ. With an effect unlike any other, it reads Action. Reveal the top card of your deck. If it is a non-Star Alliance card, its house becomes your active house. Otherwise, end your turn. Under ideal circumstances, you could practically call 2 houses in a single turn, and that notion speaks for itself. Ridiculous, combo-heavy, multifaceted turns come to fruition as a result of this, although sometimes you may get unlucky and just have to end your turn. At number 13, we have Library Card, the balanced iteration of the classic Library Access. You can get Library Card out of your hand and keep it there until you have a turn set up to use it at its best, instead of chaining yourself like you would with Library Access. Though the combo materials aren't quite as prevalent with Library Card as they were with Library Access, in the right decks you can still end up with turns just as long and significant.
At number 12 is the legendary Transporter platform. It's quickly become a staple of Star Alliance, bouncing creatures with great play effects, or that are stacked with tons of upgrades back to your hand, so you can play them all out a second time. It was a large part of what made Worlds Collide Star Alliance a house you could call over and over again and still make tons of progress, and it continued to make a large impact in the sets it appeared in going forward. Number 11 is Obsidian Forge, another key cheat artifact. Its primary purpose is that of a key cheat, a relatively easy one to pull off at that, but its versatility extends far beyond that primary purpose. Popping your own creatures for their destroyed effects, or keeping your creature count lower than that of the opponents in a Quixelstone matchup are just a few examples. Obsidian Forge just feels incredible to use, and with a decent amount of creatures, it's rarely difficult to forge a key with.
We've reached the top 10, and kicking it off in our 10th spot is Essence Scale. The combo potential, along with the great destroy triggers that show up in Mass Mutation Dis, make Essence Scale a force to be reckoned with. The huge IQ plays that can happen with this card are pretty stunning, readying and using creatures out of house to trigger abilities and effects elsewhere on the board, really expanding the influence of a turn. Obviously, Essence Scale doesn't always perform at such a level, but it's strong enough that it can.
At number 9 is Redacted, the ultimate artifact key cheat. Call Logos 4 times, you get a free key. Simple as that. In decks where Logos is a house that you'd want to call frequently throughout the game, Redacted won't take long to get you 1 key closer to victory. In addition to being immune to key cost increases, it's a ticking timer for your opponent. The game of KeyForge is, at the end of things, a race, and Redacted is just one massive speed boost.
It's the classic Untamed artifact, you all know it and love it, it's Nepenthe Seed. It's a simple effect but potent one, that of returning any card from your discard pile to your hand no matter what house you've called. Returning a key combo piece or the answer to your problem right back to your hand with no drawbacks is a tremendous ability. Hopefully your opponent doesn't find a way to use it for themselves.
At number 7 is Amphora Captura. To start off with, it enhances 6 bonus icons, which is exceptional. 2 Ember, 2 damage, and 2 draw. But it's the passive ability that truly makes it what it is. It reads, when resolving a bonus icon, you may choose to resolve it as a capture bonus icon instead. This also refers to the bonus Ember that's just naturally on cards, not even enhanced. So in decks that are loaded up with tons of bonus icons, the capture potential is immense. Amphora Captura even loads the deck with 6 enhancements itself, so no matter what, you'll always get at least 6 instances where you can resolve this ability. A check at 6 against Amphora Captura probably means you won't end up forging.
At number 6, we have the reason why the lore of Mass Mutation even exists at all, the Dark Ember Vault. Dark Ember Vault just exudes raw power and value, reading, after you play a mutant creature, draw a card. Each friendly mutant creature gets +2 power. It's single-sided benefit, extra efficiency, extra power, all wrapped up into a single package. You cycle your deck faster, boost up the power of your important mutants like Fandangle and Cephaloist, all of it enhancing the power of your deck exponentially. That is, unless you open it in a deck with like 2 mutants, and that's always rough. Probably won't be getting quite as much value out of it then, sadly.
Number 5 is the extraordinary Golden Spiral. Why this artifact is at common, we'll never understand, but it's one of the best combo cards out there. At the very worst, you still get an extra creature use out of it, be that a Reap or Fight, and that can lead into more combos in and of itself. But at the very best, it surpasses even Essence Scale in its ability. But a large part of what makes Golden Spiral what it is the set and house it appeared in. The Saurians were totally busted in Worlds Collide, and it just acted as a multiplier on the powerful things they could already do, and the way they exploited Ember on friendly creatures, which Golden Spiral adds to, by the way. It was also half of the infamous Cincinnatus Rex Golden Spiral combo, which can rule of 6 nearly an entire board in the right situations.
At number 4 is Proclamation 346E. It reads, while your opponent does not control creatures from 3 different houses, their keys cost +2. When your opponent plays this artifact against you, you pretty much just have to resign yourself to the fact that your keys will cost 8 for the whole game, unless you have a way to get rid of proc, or you can establish a sizable board of 3 different houses. However, maintaining a board of creatures consisting of 3 different houses is not an easy task, and chances are the opponent will be able to deal with your board enough to put your keys back up to 8 again. The constant key cost increase that Proclamation 346E forces on you is a very impactful tax, and one that can lead to things like Cutthroat Research and Too Much to Protect being even more effective than before. Nepenthe Seed is a great card, but it's no Orb of Wonder. While Nepenthe Seed searches the discard pile, Orb of Wonder searches the deck. Need a card for your combo? Just grab it from your deck. Need an answer to a problem creature or your opponent checking? Orb of Wonder has you covered. It's for this uninhibited searching ability that Orb of Wonder earned its spot as the number 3 artifact in our list.
At number 2 is Eaton's Jar. There are no cards in the game quite like this one, and it is a combo killer. Eaton's Jar reads, play, name a card. Until Eaton's Jar leaves play, cards with that name cannot be played. Take a look at your opponent's deck list, and there are a number of phenomenal targets for Eaton's Jar that are sure to jump out at you. Dust Pixie, Infernus, Key Charge, Stealth Mode, or any of the S-tier artifacts we've mentioned so far. Or, if your opponent has a super powerful combo, you can keep them from completing the combo using Eaton's Jar. It can set back decks that rely heavily on their combos like Jenka or Brig decks. Eaton's Jar isn't seen very often, but when it is, it's something that must be taken note of, or you'll pay the price.
Here we are. We've done it. We've finally arrived at the end of the list, at the number 1 artifact according to our rankings. We have the number 1 artifact as Autoencoder, the Logos Mass Mutation Classic, which reads, after a card is discarded from your hand, archive the top card of your deck. Autoencoder just automatically enhances the versatility of the whole deck, in a way that any other deck without Autoencoder doesn't have. Now, whenever you discard something from your hand, that discard suddenly has more value, as you're getting to archive the top card of your deck by doing so. Decks that don't have Autoencoder discard something, and nothing happens. They don't get any value out of it. It's an artifact that adds an exclusive layer to its deck, and that layer is one that adds extra efficiency and creates strategy for bigger, better turns down the road. Realistically, probably any of these S-tier artifacts could claim the spot of best artifact in perfect scenarios, but Autoencoder just adds a consistent level of exclusive power to a deck that changes the way that deck would be played without it. And for these reasons, we've chosen to complete this crazy artifact tier list by placing Autoencoder at the very top.
And there we have it. Every single artifact in the game of KeyForge ranked from worst to best. Thank you, Mortivas, for choosing to join me on this adventure. There are very few minds out there that can analyze KeyForge like you can, so I'm so glad to have you on.
Well, I thank you for bringing me on, and what a moment to celebrate for you and for the channel. Really happy for you. I'm really happy I could be here to help ring it in.
Yeah, thank you. This was an absolutely huge project, one that I knew I could not do on my own, and is also something I've been conceptualizing since I was at like 40 subscribers, so it's super cool to see it finally coming to life.
For bloopers and behind the scenes stuff, be sure to check out my Patreon, where I'll be posting that. Lots of fun moments you won't want to miss out on. And also thank you all for nearly 600 subscribers. This video was supposed to come out at 500 subscribers, but I hit that goal way faster than I expected, so it ended up getting delayed and now I'm almost at 600, so thank you guys so much for watching my content and subscribing. I never expected to hit this number of followers after just 1 year, so it's super cool to see. Again, this list is by no means authoritative or the definitive ranking. This is just the best we came up with after long discussions and debates about each individual artifact. We took our time with each placement, and hopefully you agree with at least some of them. Let us know down in the comments what you think. We would love to hear your insight or your approaches on where you personally would rank some of these. Be sure to check out Mortivas' channel and subscribe to him. He's an incredibly skilled KeyForge player and has tons of gameplays over on his channel, along with some other cool stuff you won't want to miss out on.
Alrighty, but is there anything else that you wanted to say to the viewers before we finish up here?
I think that's it. That was a pretty cool video. Really, again, happy to be a part of it, and thank you all for sticking through this far into the video. Be sure to support your man Aembermedes, and I guess we'll see you around.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you all again in the next one. See you later.